Morris, Secretary of the Loudoun County Democratic Committee and a member of our Issues Committee, which is presenting this form. The form addresses a proposed amendment to the Virginia State Constitution that will change the redistricting process if it passes. The proposed amendment is on the ballot this November, but has become controversial within the Democratic Party of Virginia. This form is being recorded and will be posted on loudoundemocrats.org. We have 4 speakers tonight. Speaking in favor of the amendment are Brian Cannon of One Virginia 2021 and Kathay Feng of California Common Cause. Speaking against the amendment are Delegate Marcus Simon, House District 53, which is composed of parts of Fairfax County plus Falls Church, and Delegate Lashrecse Aird, House District 63, composed of Petersburg plus parts of Hopewell, Chesterfield, Dinwiddie, and Prince George. Our moderator tonight is Phyllis Randall, Chair of the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors and Chair of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. Feel free to post to the chat, but if you have questions for the panelists, please post to the Q&A. Again, please post questions for the panelists to the Q&A. Phyllis, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Shelley, and thank you for all the Democrats who have planned this. I'm looking at a message from our chairperson, Lisa Savlaglio, that says that they are going to do a recap of this meeting during the general membership meeting before we vote on whether we want to support this amendment or leave it blank. And so I do have a bio for all of our guests, but they're very impressive bios, and we can happily send them out. But I actually don't want to take that time now because I want to get as many questions in as we possibly can. And I have some questions already. So I'll just kind of set the table, and then we will do our opening statements. Delegate Simon will go last on the opening statements and first on the closing statements. So what I will say is this. In the past, the way redistricting has happened in the Commonwealth of Virginia is the party in power has drawn district lines. And what that meant is that legislators pick their voters and their constituents versus voters picking their legislators. And none of us believe, none of the panelists believe that that is a good idea. And so all of the panelists agree that there needs to be a redistricting, some type of nonpartisan redistricting. The question has been what that method should look like, and is what has been passed in the General Assembly and will be on the ballot this November, the method. And so I want to level set us that they all agree on the basics that something should be different, but now we go into what that difference looks like. To the panelists, I will say, I said this before, I am notoriously timely, so I do have a stopwatch. I won't hold you all right to 3 minutes, but if you're starting to kind of get a little long, I will gently nudge you to wrap up your thoughts. And then I have questions already. And I will also read some of the questions that we have. I'm going to start first today with Brian Cannon, who is the founder and CEO of One Virginia, which is solely focused on nonpartisan redistricting in Virginia. And I do believe that that began, and you started that position in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Full disclosure, when I was in Sorensen, Mr. Cannon was one of my professors. I have known him for years and think him just to be a fantastic person. So I'm going to give him the first 3 minutes, though, to do an opening. Mr. Cannon, I hand it to you, sir.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. We're a long way from the Sorensen Institute in the early aughts. So what Virginians have is a choice on the ballot this session, or this election, between a bipartisan redistricting commission that has transparency, minority community protections, which would be historic first in the Commonwealth's Constitution, and a chance for citizens really to have a seat at the table and an equal voice in the process. Or we cannot do that, and in which case we'll have some alternative. And I do agree that both Delegate Aird and Delegate Simon want something different, but we just don't know what that is. And so a lot of this is that we've done these debates before, has led to this kind of trust us mentality from some of my Democratic friends. And I'm a Democrat too, full disclosure. I don't think that's a hard thing to say on this call, but here's my perspective on this. In 2011, I was in my last year of law school, and I participated in the advisory commission that was set up that actually drew really good maps. But it was only advisory, and the General Assembly didn't have to pay attention to it, and they ignored it. So advisory commissions, generally speaking, I don't know of anyone that's worked. This amendment is better than an advisory commission. It's a bipartisan commission, and the legislature would get to approve or reject the maps, but they wouldn't get to tinker with the maps or draw their own wholesale. And I think that's a huge improvement. I was reminded several times by some delegates that, hey, Brian, the Democratic gerrymander that the Republican gerrymander that a lot of Democrats voted for in 2011, we've got a lot of new people in there now. And I think that's really an important point because, you know, Delegate Aird, Delegate Simon weren't there in 2011, and it's not y'all's fault. But what happened in 2018 was also just as educational for me, because what happened is the federal court struck down 11 House of Delegates districts as racial gerrymanders, and then they gave it back to the legislature to redraw districts. They had to do it by Halloween. If not, the court would take it back and draw themselves. That's what ultimately happened. But instead of having public hearings, or instead of doing, you know, going around having town halls, instead of having any transparency at all, the House Democrats drew a map in a smoky back room and presented it, and it was bad. It was a very bad gerrymander. And that's 2018 Democrats, which gives me pause. They wouldn't even say who drew the maps, and New Virginia Majority called both the Democratic plan and the Republican plan put forward a racial gerrymander, and I agree 100%. This weekend, Delegate Price said of that experience in 2018 when the House Democrats were getting to redraw, that she said, my caucus was full of golems, making the Lord of the Rings reference, which I appreciate given how nerdy most people are engaged in this discussion. What's on the table, though, will stop that. It will stop the smoky back room. It will force transparency. It will give citizens a seat at the table. And what you're going to end up with is a choice between, can we take this step, which is a big one for reform, and all the national reform groups support it, or are we going to trust the Democrats to do this? And I really, as a Democrat, want to, but I don't have any evidence to support the trust us thesis that's put forward too often. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. You got 3 minutes and 19 seconds. That's pretty good, actually. Pretty good. So everyone on this call I have met except Ms. Feng. And first of all, I want to make sure I'm saying your name right. And secondly, I want to say that you have led California's Common Cause, which is dedicated to building a democracy that for everyone. You all work on voting rights, redistricting reform, and government transparency. So first of all, am I saying your name right? And secondly, if I am, you have 3 minutes. And you are muted. You may want to unmute.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
There you
well,
go.
So let me give a little bit of background on how I got into doing redistricting reform. Before I joined Common Cause, I used to work for an organization that is affiliated with Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. And I was organizing Asian and Pacific Islander communities throughout California to participate first in the census and then to wrap our heads around this gigantic thing called redistricting. And we really honestly thought that if we testified before the legislature, that they would hear us, they would see where the communities were divided, they would try to make us whole in the 2001 lines. What really happened was that after 4 months of hearings, the legislature went into closed door sessions and drew the lines that they really wanted to. In fact, I got a phone call from a San Francisco Assembly member, Democrat, who said, Kathy, you're not going to put another fucking Asian in my district. And this isn't a place that is 1/3 Asian where moving the lines by a ½ inch will accidentally put a fucking Asian in her district. The kind of arrogance and privilege, unfortunately, that happens is something that it is because it gives you tenure for 10 years. And I think the thing to really understand is that, you know, in California, a state that is controlled by a Democratic legislature, one where in every other instance we can depend on the Democratic legislature to do the right thing. After 4 months of hearings, you know, incumbents do what they do, which is to draw the lines looking backwards to the constituencies that first got them into power. And if that means that the constituency is changing, if there are populations that are growing, that's not where they're looking. They're looking at kind of holding on to the power that got them there. In 2008, California voters created the Citizens Redistricting Commission. And having that commission for the first time allowed us to draw districts that looked forward, to see how our demographics were changing, to see where the population was growing, just like in Loudoun County. In 2011, when the first commission drew those lines, California Democrats were really worried. But what they found was that there were a number of swing districts that were drawn that they were actually able to win and increase the California Democratic delegation, both in the congressional level and also in the state legislature. And not that I'm rooting for any party, but I do think that when you level the playing field, Democrats should never be afraid of winning on the merits. The reality is that the new commission also drew lines that saw a jump in the number of minorities who were elected both to the state legislature and in our congressional delegation. So our congressional delegation saw an increase of double the number of Latinos, double the number of Asian Americans, and increased Democrats by 7. We just don't see that kind of change in places where, unfortunately, when legislatures draw their own lines, they want to hold on to what they've got. In 2018, just 2 years ago.
I'm going to wind you down a little bit. You're almost at 3 minutes, 30 seconds. So
okay. Sure. Redistricting reformers won in 5 states. And the reality is that most of those states were red and purple. If we look forward to this year, there are 3 states that are considering redistricting reform: Virginia, Oregon, and Nevada. And all of those happen to be controlled by Democrats. We know that at a national level, the platform is one where we as Democrats support redistricting reform. And it would be the height of hypocrisy for us to say, but not in our own backyard where we control legislatures. I would say to the rank and file Democrats of Loudoun County, we have to stand for something more. It's why we have folks like Eric Holder, ACLU, League of Women Voters, and so many other organizations.
You're a little past 4 minutes, and so
okay.
When a whole minute past, I'm gonna pull you down. Okay, so we have Lashrecse Aird. Lashrecse is Delegate Aird, I'm sorry, represents the 63rd district, which is parts of Chesterfield County, Dinwiddie County, Prince George's County, Hopewell, and Petersburg. So a pretty diverse land area as we're talking about redistricting. She was the youngest woman ever elected to the General Assembly. And just like I gave a full disclosure on Mr. Cannon, I should give a full disclosure on Lashrecse. I consider her a friend. I consider her kind of a little sister that I am very, very proud of. And much of sometimes what I'm doing, I think of her as the person I will pass the baton to next, although she has the baton already, to be quite honest. And so she's pretty amazing, and she is speaking against the amendment. And so I'm going to give you 3 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Randall. I have to tell you, I'm fearful of this 3 minutes. So full disclosure, I'm going to do my very best. But again, good evening, Loudoun Democrats, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for having this conversation. I really just want to start my opening remarks making it clear that I am not an attorney, and so my remarks tonight will be direct, they will be clear, and sort of free of legalese. This is important to me because I believe as we've begun these conversations, the closer we get to November around the issue of this constitutional amendment, some of the jargon has become unclear, and it's become very difficult for voters to try and fully understand the ballot question, what it stands for, and what it's all about. I also think it's important that you know how I'm coming to this conversation. I am coming to this conversation as someone who ran in 2019 under new lines because of having a district that was racially gerrymandered as a result of legislators drawing my previous district lines. Yes, I am a Black woman, a Black mother, and someone who thinks about racial and ethnic communities and how this amendment will affect that representation of future minority generations. But probably most important, I'm coming to this conversation thinking about my original commitment when I ran for office in 2015, which was a commitment that I wanted to give my constituents an independent, nonpartisan commission. And I think that having seen everything how it's played out, I'm more passionate about that today than before. So I'm going to try and make a few quick points. I want to share with you, and it's ironic that Mr. Cannon brought this up, But I want to share with you and give full transparency to why this flawed amendment that calls for a commission, also known as a compromise, that's made up of legislators is the worst part of all. This amendment bakes into our Constitution emboldened powers for state representatives. When several districts like mine were struck down in Virginia due to racial gerrymandering not long ago, legislators were given the first opportunity to redraw the lines. I mean, for the first time ever, I got a chance to see what I had only heard about, had been speculated about and sort of described, which was this attempt by legislators to preserve their presence in the legislature, playing around with the maps to pick communities they were most interested in, lobbying threats at their colleagues if they didn't get what they wanted. I mean, true self-interest. And I saw that it is just impossible to remove that from the equation. This is true from the selection of the members that will serve on this commission that's proposed. It's true all the way down to their role in drawing these maps. And here's a tip. Those same legislators that I observed behaving this way, guess what? While we have many new members, they're actually very much still in office. I'm getting a little bit of an echo.
Anyone who is not muted, mute yourself right now, please.
Hey, Kathy, I think.
Oh, okay, there it's gone. Sorry.
Okay.
Also, really quickly, I'll make one additional point, which is that I want to take you back to a time before the Democratic majority was achieved, decades on decades here in our Commonwealth. And dare I say, even the early beginnings of One Virginia 2021. What is the one thing that you as voters ask for of your state representatives when discussing redistricting? You ask for an independent commission. You ask for politicians to take themselves out of the equation. With this constitutional amendment, not only are you getting a commission made up of legislators, but you're removing any chance for a future of an independent commission, a true independent commission. The proponents of this commission all have one line in common. They typically say this idea that we can improve on the process moving forward. But once this passes, what incentive does anyone have to go back and change what will be done? There is none, and it just won't happen.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I appreciate that. And our last speaker to open before the questions, and we're already getting questions, and I already have questions that were sent to me, is Delegate Margaret Simon, who represents the 33rd District in the Virginia House, which includes Falls Church and parts of Fairfax. Delegate Aird, you did say something that's completely true, is all the other panelists today are attorneys. And including Mr. Simon. Although he is on the con side, he has done a lot of work on this. And when I was reading some of the things about him, I learned that he and I have something in common because we're both known as parliamentary whizzes. So there you go. So Mr. Simon, I will give you 3 minutes.
Hey, from one parliamentarian and procedural person to another, thank you for that. And I appreciate your keeping us all on time as well. If there's one thing you take away from all of this, it's over here. There it is. I just want to be really clear about the framing of this issue because it's being framed online and a lot, that the choices you have are reformed by voting for the amendment or the status quo. And that's just not the case. So I want to make sure that everybody understands. And I think that Chairman Randall just really teed this up well. No one is advocating for the status quo, for us going back to the smoke-filled rooms to draw the lines. We all want the same thing, and we've all said the same thing for years and years and years. Unfortunately, some of us don't think the amendment does that, which is that legislators, not legislatures, it's not a URE, it's an OR, right? Legislators shouldn't be picking their constituents, and it should be the other way around. And we shouldn't have these lines drawn by legislators. And one of the lines that I keep hearing from the advocates is, hey, this would be historic. It'd be the first time a legislature is voluntarily taking legislators out of the process, except that we're not, right? We're not voluntarily giving up any power. We're just sort of consolidating it into an elite group of party leaders, right? So it's going to be 2 people that'll be picked from the Senate leadership, 2 people from the House leadership of each party, and then citizens. And there's an editorial, and Brian used this line. I saw it also in an editorial, so it's good messaging discipline, which is, hey, giving these citizens a seat at the table. Well, let's talk about how you get to the table and how you get an invitation to the party. You've got to be chosen. This is where there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this amendment. We have like 6 or 7 lines in the amendment about this panel of judges, and we're going to have a judges vote on picking an independent judge and all that. And it all sounds great, but then what all they do is pick citizens from a list that's provided to them by the leaders of the House Democrats, the leaders of the House Republicans, the leaders of the Senate, the Democrats, the Senate Republicans, right? So you look at legislatures that are set up like, or commissions that are set up like this, and what happens is Democrats usually do things like we appoint the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and good government types, and Republicans go and they appoint political consultants and donors and leaders of industry and captains of industry. So I'd be interested for everybody to know, those of you that think you have a shot at becoming one of the citizen members, read the amendment, because it's a really tough process to get on there. You've got to be blessed by the leadership. And all that's because they don't trust us not to rig the system. It's all built to just make sure we have deadlock. Right? It's all built around partisan gridlock because they think that'll force us to agree because they think we have the same incentives to agree. The problem is that if the commission fails, one side has an incentive for it to fail. One side's much better off if we can't fail than the other, and that's the Republicans, because then it gets sent to the Supreme Court. And I'm not suggesting that they wouldn't do their best to be fair, but they all come from Republican backgrounds. They're all appointed by Republicans. So if there's an incentive not to deadlock, it's not really evenly done. I would also say I agree a lot with Kathay. I mean, she talked about the example of what happens when legislators draw their districts, which is why I proposed at the end of the 2020 session, with a lot of support from Lashrecse and Marcia Price and members of the Legislative Black Caucus, a substitute amendment, which I knew wouldn't pass. I knew if it passed, it wouldn't become law because that's not how constitutional amendments work. But the idea was to make it really clear to everybody that this is not a choice between going back to doing it the old way and the amendment. It's a choice between what we would like to do now that Democrats are actually in charge of the legislature, the House, the Senate, and we have the governor's mansion. Let's do it right. Let's have an independent commission that's all citizens, that's reflective of the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, right? Not 8 people that are friends of the leadership of the House and Senate, but people that represent a broad cross-section of Virginians, that make sure communities of color are represented. Oh, by the way, that puts all this criteria that's in legislation into the amendment itself, so you can't gerrymander. You can't favor one party over the other. You can't discriminate. You can't concentrate African Americans into small districts.
Yeah, look, I'm going to wind you down now too.
So I am winding down to tell you that I think that what One Virginia 2021 was founded on, what our panelists have said they want, is what Lashrecse and I want, and the only way to get there is to vote no on the amendment so that we can do real reform in 2021.
So let me ask this question. It's a question that I received in advance, but it's also a question that hits a question in the chat, and I'm going to ask it to Mr. Cannon. The fact is that the redistricting plan, if it doesn't pass and it doesn't work, it goes to the Supreme Court, as Delegate Simon just said. Now, we know that the Supreme Court may try to do the right thing, but people are still people, and most of the Supreme Court members, if not all, were appointed by a Republican legislature. So if, in other words, does putting this in the Virginia Supreme Court, does that guarantee that it wouldn't be a partisan experience since the Supreme Court members are put there by Republicans? And it would be the same question if they were put there by Democrats. It doesn't matter what party has put them there. No matter what parties put Supreme Court members there, doesn't that make them tend to lean one way or the other? And doesn't that in and of itself take away the ideal that this would be nonpartisan? So that question's for Mr. Cannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I don't think having a court draw maps is ideal. It certainly benefited Virginia Democrats and Virginians, broadly speaking, this decade. But what happens when courts get this task, I want to be clear that there are 6 members of the Supreme Court of Virginia that would be considering this. There is a 7th, but she's related to a sitting senator, so she would be excluded from the process by judicial canon ethics stuff. But the 6th, it's kind of a 3-to-3 mix. Like Bill Mims is one of the legislators, or one of the justices. He's a former Republican legislator. I would guess that
from Loudoun County. From
Loudoun County.
Yeah.
Senator Mims was probably barely considered a Republican by his colleagues back then, but I think highly respected. And so I think we've got good jurists on the bench that would do a fair job, but more importantly, they wouldn't do the job at all. They hire a special master, some expert from usually out of state, and they bring that person in and they do it. So what you see is you know, we're not the Wisconsin State Supreme Court where they literally get into fistfights up there. Like, our court isn't like that. But what you see if you look at all the courts around the country that have ever drawn districts, whether they're state courts or whether they're federal courts, and Virginia's never drawn districts, so there's no example in Virginia, but all the other ones, they hire a special master, they draw maps down the middle of the road that are objectively neutral and nobody's too excited about, but they're down the middle. They're not a partisan gerrymander one way or another, and that's it. So there's never an example of a court gerrymandering. Whereas the alternative and all the other advisory commission things that were proposed by the House Democrats this year would have sent the matter back to the legislature. If the commission deadlocks, it goes back to the legislature, they can do whatever they want. And that's why I don't think advisory commissions work, because there's never an example of a court gerrymandering, but there's never an example of a legislature not gerrymandering.
Thank you, thank you. Another question I've received, this is for Delegate Aird. A Washington Post article from March 6 quoted you as saying the following: supporting this amendment amounted to the devaluation of the Black voices in this chamber. In this chamber meant the General Assembly. Can you further comment on how the amendment would equate to devaluing Black voices?
Thank you, Phyllis. I think it's important to add some context here before jumping right into the amendment question. You know, I've had the fortune of serving as a legislative aide and now a legislator, and having sort of a front row seat to how our legislature has operated and how it has not leveraged the unique experiences of Black members. I've seen the conscious investment in the disproportionate representation of Black people and minority populations through the lawmaking process, to be precise. Even with us crying out, if you look at Virginia's statistics and the many different measures of how minorities and Blacks are performing in a number of categories in the Commonwealth, there's a disproportionate impact and representation of the harm that's been done by not listening to Black members as we have cried out on issues over the years. In the instance of the constitutional amendment, when other Democratic lawmakers sided with Republicans, it was Black members that saw from the very beginning what was happening and what this meant and spoke out. In 2020, Black lawmakers again have doubled down on that position, and they've learned, and I've learned through my colleagues who are more intimate with the process, that not one person of color and only one woman was at the table when this actual compromise was offered. Black legislators have been told throughout this entire process that their handles would be, their concerns would be handled later, which is what we have historically been told. And not only that, but if you ask the question, well, you have Black legislators in the Senate that are supporting this. Anybody who's good at math can tell you that a ratio of 17 to 3 or 4 is overwhelmingly still on the other side. And for some reason, people want to continue to make that argument. But as my dear friend Delegate Price just recently said, why should these senators that, in my opinion, are on the wrong side of the issue be held as champions for redistricting reform when they're really the obstacles to that and what we really want? And so the mere arguments that have been made to date is a true indication of how Black voices still are continuing to be devalued in our legislature and have been for years prior to now.
Thank you. Ms. Feng, first of all, am I saying your name right? Is it Feng? Am I saying your name right? Did she drop off?
I think we lost her. I've texted her, Phyllis.
Her? Okay, yeah. Okay. Would you text her? Okay, well then we will come back. Delegate Simon, I'm actually getting questions about the Redistricting Commission that you proposed, that you said would be made entirely of citizens with no legislative members. What was your goal in offering that amendment, and why do you think it failed? And can you explain what that was a little bit more? Because I think there's a lot of confusion about what that amendment for that Redistricting Commission was, and I'm seeing a lot of questions about that.
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about that. And I think it's related to the reason, one of the other questions, the reason that the enabling legislation failed to pass, right? So there's been an alternative to the amendment that's been floating around since the beginning of session. Sia Price's bill, HB 1256. She had a bill that passed, 1255, which establishes criteria. She also had 1256, which would have established an all citizens commission that would have been made up of I think different iterations and versions had different numbers, but made up of citizens with the goal of, again, having a broad spectrum that represented the whole Commonwealth to sit on a commission and draw maps and to use criteria, again, that we established and we've adopted in HB 1255 to try and, one, to end gerrymandering for political advantage, to end also racial gerrymandering, make that illegal, and so forth. My goal in then rewriting that in the form of an alternative constitutional amendment was to give, frankly, members of the House on the day that we voted on that, the constitutional amendment, an opportunity to vote for something. Because parliamentarily, the problem was, if you didn't want this to become part of the Constitution, the only choice you had going into the debate was to vote no on the amendment that was before us. It's identical to the amendment that passed in 2019. And to give folks an opportunity not to vote no against something, because I think they were afraid they'd come home and say, why were you against a commission? Why were you against reform? Why were you against trying to change the process by which we pick legislators? Because they're not against that. We gave them an opportunity to vote for something else, which was to show that we're not against reform. We're against having legislators dominate the commission. We're against citizens that are only picked by legislators. We're against a system that is built to fail and kick it to the courts. We're against not including minorities in the text of the actual Constitution, but only in legislation which could be overturned by subsequent legislatures. So the goal was to give folks an opportunity to vote for something. And this is the hard part, frankly, going into this ballot question, because we are left with having to ask for people to vote no. But I just want it to be really clear. Voting no on the amendment doesn't mean you're voting for old-fashioned redistricting. It certainly doesn't mean you're voting against reform. It means you prefer a pure form, much more similar to what Ms. Feng was talking about, what they do in California today. That's what our goal is.
Let me follow up on that, Miss, because I'm getting these questions too. If it's a no and it fails, then how long are we going to wait before we see redistricting, and what's happening? And what if the legislature flips and it goes back to the Republicans? Are we sitting under the same rules that we're sitting under now? And so how many more years would we have to wait for there to be nonpartisan redistricting, and how long would we be living under the rules as they currently exist? And what happens if those rules are now ruled again by a Republican legislature?
So, great question. The first thing we would do is we would go back in January. Well, we didn't even have a special session, frankly. So the enabling legislation that was supposed to go with the constitutional amendment, we actually amended that in conference to add an if it passes A, if it fails B option. And the option B would have been the citizen commission. We have the language ready to go. If it fails, I would introduce that. We could do it in a special session in November. We could do it in January. But the good news, bad news here is the census data that we use to build the maps is going to be late. Everybody knows there's no way it's coming on time. So we've got time to get this part right, to establish a commission, give them time to hold their public hearings, do their work. And then the next thing we'll do is introduce a constitutional amendment so that we can get this language into the Constitution. So for 2031, it'll be part of the constitutional amendment. By then, it'll be part of the Constitution.
So and I just want to quickly, before you leave this point, I just quickly want to capitalize on this idea of trust, because this has been attacked, and I've heard it during session. We were arguing, well, we can't trust that you're going to come back and do the right thing. And I just want to emphasize what Delegate Simon is saying. You know, when Democrats got in control, the first thing we did was pass those bills that we promised to pass and that we asked you to trust that we're going to do at the start of this session. And in a very historical way, we did that. And throughout this entire conversation, we have been saying we are not against a true independent commission. So this idea that there hasn't been any demonstration of trust and we can't depend on that, it's purely false. And what Delegate Simon is describing is actual proof of the attempts that we have made, and the reason why you can trust that the moment we're given the opportunity, we're going to do that.
Okay, I want to get Ms. Feng back in. First of all, am I saying your name right? Tell me how to say your name.
Feng.
Feng.
But that's okay. All my life I've heard it.
It's actually not okay. I think people's names should be pronounced like they want them to have pronounced. Right, Lashrecse?
Thank you.
So my question to you is, you have an incredibly impressive resume when I read it over. And what I noticed more than anything else is your entire life, your entire career, you've been fighting for minorities. You've been fighting for people who might not be heard or seen. You've spent your life fighting for that population. So at this point, you stand for an amendment in Virginia that many believe do not have language that protects the interests of minority communities, and that the Virginia Congressional Black Caucus does not support. How do you kind of
Square that.
Square that, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I'm just going to say, Virginia, you all have it hard. To make a constitutional amendment, you got to go 2 times through your legislature and 1 time through a vote of the people.
Yeah.
So my standards for what can be achieved in a state like California or another state that has an initiative process is a little different, right, than other states that just don't have that. What I will say about the amendment that's being proposed is that in the Constitution, if it were to pass, it would put Federal Voting Rights Act protections into the state constitution. We all know what's happening with the Supreme Court and how it has whittled back protections like Section 5 protections and really undermined a lot of the most protective parts of the Voting Rights Act. And if we put it into state constitutions, we've seen time and time again, whether that was the lawsuit in Pennsylvania or the one in North Carolina, that state constitutions have become a new place where minorities can seek protections and get them if we embed some of that good language in. Now, what the language is being proposed for the constitutional amendment would put the Voting Rights Act protections, and it would also be the first constitutional protections for people of color in the history of the state put into the state constitution. We could then sue on it if the maps were not drawn well. I will just say one other thing, which is I absolutely, hope that the Virginia comes back to it and sort of says, what else can we do? But when you open up the possibility of a hybrid commission, which this one is, it's citizen-led, at the very least, what happens is we open up the process to citizen participation. And I can't tell you just how empowering that is for a lot of communities that never have felt heard, to at least come before a body where they feel like my words, my community, for the first time, I'm being put on the map. And I think that that's a very empowering process that then allows people to take the next step, which is have a conversation about what else. If the commission is something that could be improved on, that won't happen for another 2 years because of the way that constitutional amendments have to go through the route. If that was the case for the current democratically controlled legislature in 2020, Sia Price's bill could have been voted on the floor, and it wasn't. And so I guess what I would say is, let's wait for that bird in the hand to actually exist. But right now, the bird in the hand that we have is this constitutional amendment.
I see a comment that it's not actually a question, it's just a comment, but I thought it was such an interesting comment that I actually wanted just to read it to you. It says, should they prevail with Delegate Simon and Aird and others be setting up a should they prevail with Delegates Aird and Simon and others be setting up a vast nonpartisan cadre of statewide volunteers to seek and galvanize public support and a more pure version of the bill. They must work tirelessly at public venues and at the polls and at every opportunity to get where we are now and frame the issue in a fresh way to avoid voter fatigue. So what I'm reading in that statement, and that's a really, I think, powerful statement, is for the people who are, for Delegate Aird, for Mr. Simon, if this fails, the work that you all would have to do over the next maybe a couple of years to explain what we're trying to do and why and what the difference is would be a very huge lift. Are you all ready to do that lift if this fails? Because, are we going to miss a bird in the hand for something better if you're not ready to lift that heavy over the next couple of years? And that's just kind of a 30-second answer from the two of you before I go back to Mr. Cannon. So, Mr. Simon?
So I think that everybody agrees this is going to take more work regardless of the outcome. I think we heard from Ms. Feng, and I think we've heard from Brian that this amendment is not perfect and it needs work. We need to come back and do more work. So the work needs to be done anyway. And yes, the short answer is yes. Okay. And I think we've worked pretty tirelessly with this heavy lift, which is try and convince people that this isn't a great amendment. We'll work even harder to get a good amendment passed.
And I'll just quickly say that this issue is so important, not just to me, but as the mother of 2 young boys, Black boys at that, and the representation that they're going to need, that absolutely this is a non-issue for me of doing that hard work.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to Mr. Cannon. I got this question. Mr. Cannon, when all of one party and only 9 members of the other party votes on the bill, does that not signal that that bill does not really have bipartisan support? And if Virginia 1's goal is bipartisan support, do you think that these votes that happen in the General Assembly clearly says that this has missed the mark?
So, you know, the House Democratic Caucus is very interesting in this. And what I would suggest is that they're going to be the obstacle to redistricting reform, further improvements, regardless of what happens in November. You've got really good delegates who I really admire, like Delegate Vivian Watts. And she said this publicly, so I'm not speaking out of school, said, I think every commission needs to have legislators on it. That's just what she believes. She believes legislators know their district better than anybody else. They should be on it. That's fine, but that's one, you know, you got 55, now you're 54. I've had at least 5 Democratic delegates tell me personally that they just think it's their turn to gerrymander and screw Republicans over. So while Delegate Simon and Delegate Aird are genuinely doing good work, and I believe will be a critical part in our fight going forward, and I hope we'll have more Republicans join us than we've had traditionally on independent redistricting, I just don't see the votes there. And that's a real problem going forward.
Okay, all right, that's fair. That's a fair answer. I'm going to go to one of the questions I see, and this may be for anyone. How is an advisory, this may be a Delegate Simon question. How is an advisory commission fundamentally different than the status quo if the General Assembly retains ultimate map drawing power?
So the Constitution right now says that the General Assembly is going to draw the districts, and so the map has to come ultimately to the General Assembly to draw the districts. Again, subject to the governor's veto. You know, it's been a bill. You know, under the current system, we do it as a bill. I know that some folks have said that it's solely the province of the General Assembly, but we've got to get it through both houses of both parties, and we've got to get the governor to do it. Democrats have called for independent redistricting reform. We haven't been. I know that that's not what we're hearing today. My experience has been that generally the obstacles have been the Republicans in the legislature. Part of the reason, you know, I voted for the amendment in 2019 was I thought that was maybe the only thing we could get from a Republican-led General Assembly. Now that we have Democrats in charge, I believe, my experience maybe is different than Brian's, maybe they're not being honest with me, but I believe we've got the will to do this. And I think, you know, talk about being politically embarrassing to have voted for this in 2019 and not pass it at the ballot. Democrats really wouldn't be able to look the electorate in the face if we didn't take the commission we created and take their advice seriously. We had a different situation in 2011. You had a Republican governor, you had a Democratic Senate, and you had a Republican House, which was really, under Bill Howell, committed to not doing anything other than drawing their districts their way. The Senate finally kind of capitulated and said, look, you draw yours, we'll draw ours. And you know, the governor said, fine, I'll sign it. So I think we have a much different bodies in the chamber and a different set of circumstances now.
Okay. Ms. Feng, I'm going to go back to you, Kathy, because I actually know Mr. Cannon and I know Delegate Aird, and I've met Mr. Simon once or twice on the committee again whenever I want to drive through his house. But you're in California, so I don't know you yet, and so all I know of you is your incredible bio. But reading your bio again, what I've learned about you is that you will work for years on something that you think is correct to do before you see the fruits of your labor, which is a good thing. That's a very good thing. So let me ask you this. Knowing that sometimes it takes many years to get something right, do you believe at this point the General Assembly should do something that many members think it's not right, most of the Black Caucus thinks it's not right, versus holding up, holding back, and waiting to get something, a better product versus getting it sooner?
Yeah. I will say that like Delegate Aird, I am a mom, and one thing that moms are is tenacious, but also pragmatic. I was pregnant when we were trying to negotiate with the legislature for 3 years with California's redistricting reform, and we really hoped beyond hope that the legislature was going to put something on the ballot and do it the right way, right? And we were really willing to kind of go along with a lot of different compromises that would keep the legislature on board, the Democrats supporting it, and push this thing through. And it was really hard to watch a lot of Democrats people who are strong civil rights champions, basically in the end say, you know what, I kind of know this system, right? This system where I get direct input about how my lines are going to be drawn, which donors I'm going to pick, you know, what constituencies I want that voted for me last time. And that's a system that I'm comfortable with. And so even after 3 years of negotiating, it just didn't happen. And so what I'll say is that as tenacious as I am, finally it came to a point where it's like, you know what? If we have to write it, let's write it the way we want to, and let's see what the voters say. In this instance, Virginia has an opportunity to pass something. And do you have the opportunity to come back at it and make it better? Absolutely. After 2008 in California, we adopted a redistricting commission. It only drew the lines for the legislature. There were some things that we left out. And we came back in 2010 and we said, hey, voters, you now saw a little bit of this in action. What do you think? And the support for it went out the roof because they saw the kind of civic participation that was awakened around something that at that time was a pretty obscure issue. Nobody cared about redistricting. They didn't want to learn about it. Now it's a hot button issue. So what I would say is give people a taste of what democracy tastes like. And I guarantee you, people are going to want to come back for more. And then we can get everything that we want, but we also don't lose along the way.
Okay, so then I'm going to go to Delegate Aird and ask you a similar question, although opposite, similar but opposite. So many have said that this bill is better than nothing. And this battle has been raging for many years. And the Democrats are in charge. The sponsor of the bill admits that it's not perfect, but he says that he believes it's a, quote, good bill. He's also a high school civics teacher. So at some point, do you just say to yourself, I should compromise? Because that's how the General Assembly works. The General Assembly works on compromise, and not everyone gets exactly what they want. And so some people got some of what they wanted, and everyone kind of goes halfway, and that's what the General Assembly is. It's a compromise, and that's what I'm going to do. So how do you feel about that?
Thanks, Chairwoman. I appreciate you for that question. And, you know, that's correct. I consider myself to be also a pragmatic legislator, as Delegate Simon says. And I often tell this story to my constituents that when you start with a piece of legislation, it starts out as a dog, evolves into a cat, and finishes as a fish. That is therefore the legislative process. But Phyllis, that simply can't be the case when we're talking about the Constitution. I trust that, you know, each of you consider yourselves to be sort of like principled with great respect to the Constitution. So I have to tell you that when it comes to this constitutional amendment, that is a hyper-partisan approach, and the Constitution being our most important unifying document. As principled voters, I have to implore you to vote against turning it into a political football, all for the sake of compromise, which is ultimately what this does. You know, so these conversations about it's the best we can do, it's a step forward, it's better than nothing, it's something, it may offer a more transparent process. Let's be clear, when it comes to the Constitution, we need to be absolutely sure and confident that this is the approach to take. You know, and lastly, I'll just saying that as leaders, leadership is knowing which issues that you don't waver on and where you have to, where it's okay to find common ground. So in this case, I am strongly in a position to say, this is not the place where we need to waver, and we can do better, and we should not just settle for something.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cannon, did you want to weigh in on that? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, just real quick, Madam Chair, I would want a perfect amendment if possible. I've never seen one. I've never seen one. And if anybody's watched the movie Lincoln, right, it's a battle for the 15th Amendment. It's vital. That thing's not perfect at all, but it was still a really good point. There's just nothing perfect in our Constitution. Quite frankly, I don't hold our state constitution. It's not some sacred document that came down on high. It was passed in 1972 to get rid of a really racist constitution from 70 years before, and they took from racist to race neutral. It's not that great of a document. We should improve it.
And quite frankly, passing this amendment doesn't improve it. It bakes in those protections that are not, it eliminates the protections that we should be making sure are there. This does not make it better.
And as far as this idea, Madam Chairman, if it's okay, if I might, perfecting along the way or coming back, you know, what we still have in the Virginia Constitution, and still haven't gotten rid of it, is a ban on marriages between anything other than one man and one woman. You know, we have the Marshall-Newman Amendment still there. It's hard to change the Constitution, and it's really hard to change it back. And that's why it's worth getting it right first before we go ahead and monkey around with the Constitution.
Delegate Simon, I am getting a lot of questions again about a commission. If this didn't pass, how a commission looks and how a commission works. One of the questions asked, will the legislators and citizens be from different districts? I'm asking who would be on them, who would choose them. I know you've talked about this once, but the questions about the commission are still coming in. And so I thought I'd give you another shot at that. I want to make sure people, whenever you see a question get asked again, it probably means that it didn't get answered well the first time. So I'm going to give you another shot at that.
All right, so the commission that we've got under the amendment, the current amendment, would not necessarily have any members from different districts. It wouldn't necessarily have people of different races or genders, or it's whoever the party leaders pick. And there's no real criteria for picking those members currently. You know, if you want to let me come back to this, I'll pull up my substitute if that's what people are sort of looking for. I will say that, again, the substitute was really a straw proposal, you know, to give somebody something to vote for. But if people want to get really into the weeds, I can cut and paste it into the chat. Or I can pull it up and answer that more thoroughly.
So you can't ever ask me, do I want to get in the weeds? Because I am a let's get in the weeds person. So I'm going to,
give me a minute then and I'll catch up.
Everyone on this call is a let's get in the weeds person. So we're going to go past the let's get in the weeds moment for just a second. I'm going to go back to some of the questions. Just one second. Let me see the one I had not reached yet. Oh my gosh. Sorry about that. I almost lost you. This question goes back to Mr. Cannon. Sorry about that. Mr. Cannon, same question that was asked, but in the opposite direction. If the legislation does not pass, or does pass in November, are you willing to go out and talk to people about what the legislation does, what it doesn't do, help people really get up on the matter and the subject, and help them understand what happens next? And you keep saying that it may not be perfect. We may have to revisit it. Are you willing to be the person who takes up that mantle and says, this is how we go revisit it. This is how we make it better. You just said no constitutional amendment is perfect. Are you willing to work for a even better amendment over time? Or are you going to have a beer when this is done?
I'm not going to say I won't have a beer when this is done, but I do plan to continue to work on this. Kathay is actually my inspiration, and I've gone to her for advice over the years on this, and her tenacity is not something that's lost on me. I would say that, look, the win is not whether this amendment passes in November. The win for Virginia on the redistricting reform movement is fair maps in 2021. Now they're going to be delayed because the census is backward, all that kind of stuff, but fair maps in 2021 is the goal. Now, I think the constitutional amendment, because of all the transparency, because of the minority protections, because of the citizens at the table, gets us the best shot at fair maps in 2021. Because I've seen what happens in blue states when Democrats control this thing, what districts they draw. They draw Democratic gerrymanders, and I don't think that's fair to the people. But what I think this does, and everybody on this should be very aware, this amendment creates space for citizen oversight, creates space for citizens at the table, but we got to take those seats, right? We got to get people out involved, and I've learned a lot from what they've done in California to go and recruit people to ask to serve on the commission, to go and recruit communities to get together and come up with unity maps, particularly in places like Loudoun that are fast growing with minority populations. Things are tricky. Well, we should have those communities come together and propose maps, right? And I think that's the long run, the long win in 2021. I think our commission gives us the best shot at it.
Okay, so what you're saying is you would come back at this again, and you would be committed to doing that. And so a win in November would not be where it stopped for you. So Kathay, you've done this before. I think with Delegate Simon and Delegate Aird are saying that many people feel like, to come back at something again. And truthfully, to be honest, if you know the General Assembly in Virginia, it is true that once something happens, people are pretty loath to come back to the same thing again, and they get on to the next thing. Our General Assembly is a part-time legislature. They only meet for, what, 3 months? And so they're not in session full-time like they are in California. And so many, they're very busy in a session, and so many things come up. And so same question, if this passes, but it's not the bill we want, you're in California. How committed are you to coming back to Virginia over and over again and working on this bill?
Well, I'm 20 years committed right now. So I will say that, you know, let me take a step back and sort of think about this outside of just the partisan context. You know, in California, when the commission took over, so before the commission, and we were doing, you know, kind of community participation, the legislature held a total of 12 hearings. And we were already thinking that was a lot, right? When the Citizens Commission came in, they decided that they were going to blow that box up, and they held over 100 public hearings and meetings. So every step of the way, the process became transparent. I was in hearing rooms where the line out the door started 2 hours beforehand for people to kind of line up and get their opportunity to testify. And when they went before the commission had a mapper where they would project onto a screen, and every time there was a line that was changed or community testimony was taken in, you could see it on the screen. It was reflected back. It created this huge appetite for participation that we've never seen around redistricting before. I mean, really, this went from an obscure issue that nobody touches to like, oh, wow, that's exciting, right? Even when draft lines are put out there that are horrible, I guarantee you the hearings are even more packed. So since then, right, the participation level has only increased. Now we have a lot of organizations that are community-based. They're not your traditional statewide civil rights groups. They're community-based, they're local, and they're asking, how can we get involved? How can we tell our story? How can we go before the commission? How can we put our names in as applicants? And I think each step of the way, we refine that process. And sometimes it's with the legislature's help, sometimes it's without. But the point is that once you kind of bring people into it, regular everyday citizens, they get that appetite for what is possible, and they say we want more. So this time around, each time we've gone through it, everyday citizens have come back and said, okay, here's how we'd like to improve that process. And the appetite for it grows larger and larger, and the backing for the idea of citizen participation also gets larger. It takes it from what has always traditionally been a backroom process that people didn't have a whole lot of ideas about to something where they see it, they feel it, they want to participate, and they hunger for more.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great answer. So Delegate Simon, I got a question that says, it's an interesting question. I hesitated on asking it, but I think it's a fair question.
Go ahead, absolutely.
It says, convince me that this opposition is not just the Democrats taking their turn at gerrymandering. And it's a fair question because, you know, people are human beings. And after you get slapped around a lot for many years by one party that's been in power for a long time, and then you get in power, it's human nature to want to do a little slapping around yourself. That's not all that unusual. And so what of the idea that maybe this is Democrats saying, we've had the Republicans gerrymander our districts for years, and we've had all the minority groups being put into one seat for years, and we won the election. Elections have consequences, so now maybe it's our time to do a little gerrymandering. How do we know that's not what's happening here?
Well, you can look at sort of the way that Democrats have approached a number of other problems, I guess, for example, right? And where there have been opportunities to sort of settle scores, we're held to a different standard. You know, we talked about a little bit with, you know, who you expect the Democrats to appoint to the Citizen Commission, and I guarantee you, when you look at it at how it gets done, we would do it differently. But I guess the answer to that is we've said we want this all along. There's not really a great answer about how to convince you. I'm trying to avoid, you can see me struggling to avoid the word trust me, right? The answer is that Democrats and Democratic committees, the fact that this Democratic committee here in Loudoun is so anxious to see reform, I don't see any delegate from Loudoun County turning their back on that and then having to stand for re-election in 2 years. I don't see any Democrat in Fairfax County or Alexandria or Arlington saying that we support reform, refusing to reform, and then having to turn back and face that Democratic primary electorate. Because that's ultimately what it's not a matter of trust. The fact is that we hear loud and clear from Democrats in Loudoun and Alexandria and Arlington and everywhere that they want reform, which is why this message is so carefully calibrated, right? It is because we also believe in reform. We believe in a better form of reform. We believe in a purer reform that we oppose the amendment. And I could not come back having been on every Zoom. Here's the other thing that's beautiful about this. We've got 60 participants here on video chat on a Thursday, Wednesday, what night is it? Wednesday night, Thursday night in the middle of July. You would not have had this kind of participation had I been doing this pitch at a high school gymnasium. You know, everybody be on vacation. So the good news, bad news is it's all on videotape, right? It's all here. And it's all going to be posted and recorded. And believe me, if I try to do anything different, you're going to play this back. And it's going to be right there. So, I think some of it's a function of the era that we're in. The fact this is all there, it's all on tape. It's not just a trust me moment. It's not like I can back out of what I said. The words are there, but believe me, the tweets are there. I've said some tweets I'd rather try and pull back, but you can't. And God forbid you try and delete it, because then everybody in the world already has a screen capture. 5 times as many people see it, right? So it's all there. We're on the record. We've said it. There's no way we could back away from this and get away with it. I just don't believe that could happen.
So, Mr. Cannon, I have a logistical question for you. By law, the Census Bureau was going to deliver the census counts to each state on April 1st, 2021. But now that has been delayed because of COVID to July 31st, 2021. Do you think that the census count that will be delivered later or the census delays that we have across the board will make any difference when it comes to November?
No, I think the delay of census is a huge problem. I'm very concerned about it. Kathay's in litigation trying to make sure it's good. And I think everybody here agrees that you want as accurate a count as humanly possible. And the Trump administration is not giving that to us. And then you lay over a pandemic on top of it, and it's next to impossible. There's all sorts of things going on about it. But I will say that whether or not you support the amendment itself, or want to do it in an alternative way, it's agnostic to the issue of whether the census is at issue, because the census is going to be delayed. Quite frankly, it'll give the commission, which has to get up and running by January of 2021, it'll give them more time to have public hearings if they so choose, or it would give time for any alternative commission to have that. So I think that they're really separate, even though both very important.
Okay. Delegate Aird, I hesitate to ask you this question because I don't want to ask you all the questions that are the questions about the Black Caucus, because one, you're not speaking for the Black Caucus, and two, but I still think it's a valid question. It seems that on this issue specifically, on others possibly, but on this issue specifically, the voice of the Black Caucus came late and didn't punch through. So why do we think that happens, and why? Okay. So in my office, because I'm a Democrat that cares about the environment, my lights are on a timer, and if there's no movement, my lights go off. That's just me being environmentally sensitive, that sometimes I end up in the dark. That's just how it goes. Why do we think that the Congressional Black Caucus didn't have a stronger voice? And why do we think the Congressional Black Caucus were not able to convince their Democratic colleagues of why this wasn't a good bill for minorities? And again, I apologize, and you don't speak for every African-American in the Black Caucus, but you are a member, and I know you have some strong feelings on that. And so I am getting the question. I don't think it's a terrible question, so I thought I would ask of it.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I will say this is the whole reason why I'm here. I don't think Delegate Simon will have felt comfortable to answer the Black questions, which ultimately this is part of this conversation. I want to go back to the question you asked earlier about the devaluation of Black voices. That question, in my opinion, innately speaks to this question you're now asking. In 2019, Black Caucus members, including the Black Caucus chairman, stood up on the floor of the House of Delegates and passionately made a plea to not support this when it first came up. in 2020, I don't believe that we were late to the party. We continued to sing out and cry out about why this issue was so important to us and all the problems that existed to us, for us. But if you think about, again, this idea around the devaluation of Black voices, that again is the answer. And I just think I can't say enough times, people question the 17 that were so passionate about the amendment because there were a few in the Senate that were in a different position. Well, let's be clear, Black people and the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus isn't a monolith. And we can have a full conversation about people historically that have been minorities and or Black people and vote against or advocate against their own self-interest. But when you look again at the ratio of the number of people that were for this and our voices were ignored, we can talk about the people who, the Democrats that supported this, with the exception of a few. Some of them are so new that they don't know where the bathroom is. And so we could have a conversation about that too. So this idea that Black caucus members were late to the party and that, you know, our voices were not heard, it's unfortunate, but that's just simply not the case.
Wonderful, wonderful answer. Thank you. My Sorensen instructor tells me that I move my arms a lot when I talk, which means that my Sorensen instructor did not do a good job when I was in Sorensen.
You don't move them enough, Madam Chair, because you keep the lights on if you moved them a little more.
Maybe. So I'm going to ask one more question before we go to wrap up. I'm going to go to wrap up first will be Delegate Simon, because I think he has to jump off. And this question came in, and I'll just read the question. And I think this may be a question for Delegate Simon. Can we touch on what is fair? If Dems win the Virginia statewide offices like the U.S. Senate, the governor's races, etc., by 5 to 6%, how is it that the GOP controlled the legislature for so many years? Is it considered gerrymandering to rebalance districts to represent the electorate? That question came from Steve. That's an excellent question. Delegate Simon, you want to take a run at that one?
Please, I love that question. I mean, you know, seriously though, one of the things I've asked about this before is, would this system make sense in a place like Utah? Right, which, let's take Utah as an example, which is a very Republican state. Would it make sense for them to have 50% Democrats and 50% Republicans drawing districts with the goal of trying to get them roughly balanced, or would that not really accurately reflect the state? I think this idea of a 50-50 partisan gridlock makes some sense right now in the moment we're in, where we're about 21-19 in the Senate and 55-45 in the House. It sounds about right. But you know, I think that districts ought to represent the state as a whole. I think that Virginia, which is a bluing state, I get criticized for this. Simon just wants to do a Democratic gerrymander. No, to the extent that Virginia is turning bluer, I think that our legislature ought to move with it. I think that when Democrats get the vast majority of the votes cast for state legislature across the state, that they probably ought to control the legislature. They ought to have the most seats. And so, you know, I think there are other considerations. This amendment is super, super focused on protecting minority parties, right? It's really about protecting the right of the minority party, and frankly, to the exclusion of what I said in my first speech about is actual minorities and minority communities. Minority communities are taken care of in legislation that every single Republican voted against, by the way. Every single Republican voted against the language that would protect minority communities, but minority political parties are guaranteed parity in this process. And so I think it's a great question.
Say that one more time. Every single Republican voted against protecting. Say that one more time.
So we have a criteria bill, HB 1255, that had explicit protections for communities of color, had the language that says you can't pack them into so as to diminish their influence, or can you spread them out so much that you diminish their influence? And that language, which was in our criteria bill, was defeated, and I don't think it got a single Republican vote. I know I had a party line vote in the Senate, and I don't think it got any Republican votes in the House either.
That's not true. It got Republican votes in both chambers. And it was either that or it was Senator McClellan's SB 717. It's the exact same bill, exact same language. It got bipartisan votes, Delia. I'm sure you're just misremembering, but it really did.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Mr. Cannon. Appreciate that. So we're going to start winding up, and we're going to do a 3-minute closing for everybody, which will take 12 minutes, which is why I'm starting a little early, because I want to give everybody time just in case they run over, and because we're going to stop at 8:30 because that's exactly who I am. So Delegate Simon, I'm going to go to you first. I know you have to jump off. And Delegate Simon, you're not actually sitting in Purcellville. So that was I'm assuming you're not sitting in Purcellville, Virginia and Western Loudoun County, correct?
That is correct.
What was the
Go ahead if you want
background?
let's talk about transparency, right? Hold on. Let me be transparent here. So I'm really just sitting in a pretty boring office with a couple of things sitting up against
I
the
love
wall.
that background. I think that was very smart. I did catch it. The chair of the county caught that you were sitting in front of the Purcellville train station, which is now the WO&D Trail. So that speaks to mass transit and it speaks to the environment. And you're in my county. So good. You hit that one out the park. Good job.
Thank you.
Your turn. And if you want to do like a 3-minute closing, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure, and I'll do my best to keep this to 3 minutes. Again, if you take one thing away, this is not a choice, and I think I really appreciate one. I think your panel, your moderator, the job you did as moderator was fantastic. I really want to compliment you on the questions that you asked, the way you asked them, the way you really drew us out and called us to task. And I think that the questions I got from the audience were really excellent questions. People really do understand this issue. I think they're not missing anything. They're pointed questions that got right to the heart of the issue. So thank you all for your participation. This is an opportunity here to get this right or to bake a flawed system into the Constitution of Virginia. The Constitution, as we've said, is really hard to change on purpose. And what we put in there, yes, it's not always going to be perfect, but it shouldn't be this fatally flawed. We shouldn't put in the current political, lock in the current political balance for what it's worth. We should be open also to making sure that, the part that gets permanent, ought to include the language about not concentrating communities of color. It ought to make sure that we have something that represents all Virginians. The districts that I think we all want the same thing. We want it to be fair. We want a process that ensures that the legislature of Virginia accurately reflects the makeup of Virginia in a number of ways, politically, racially, gender, different religions, different walks of life, different professions. And so I think the best way to achieve what I think we all want is to vote no on this amendment in November. Work with us. If you have questions about the specifics, if you want to have a selection panel made up of judges to pick the citizen members, come work with us. Let's get it right the next time with Democrats who really believe in this. This was the Cole Amendment. That's going to be my final word on this because I probably have my 3 minutes. This was the Mark Cole Amendment in 2019. Mark Cole, who fought tooth and nail against any kind of gerrymandering reform up until they came within one vote of losing the House. And so let's work with Democrats who really believe in this to get it right. We get a much better product in 2021. Thank you,
sir. Thank you so much. I know you may have to drop off. We appreciate you having you on. Thank you very much. Kathy, I'm going to go to you. Are you still on?
I am. Hi.
Okay. Hi. How are you? We're going to go for you. I'm going to go to you. If you'd like to give us 3 minutes of a closing. And first of all, Kathy, I do look forward to meeting you again. Your bio is just amazing. And the fact that you're doing this and you don't live in Virginia tells us how much you care about all these issues. And so thank you very much for being here. And 3 minutes to give a closing.
Absolutely. I think that it's important to remember that the commission that is created is something that has to last for multiple decades, right? And so one of the reasons for building in some partisan balance is that over time, you don't know what the flip-flop of the legislature's control is going to be, but you do want to make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard by when it's drawing lines. I think that, when a commission draws the line, it's the way that the demographics are changing in a state, and in particular in places like Loudoun County, those voices need to be heard. In California, our commission, which was half Democratic, half Republican, and believe me, that is an overrepresented regular people, was able to have a conversation, listen to the testimony, and ultimately draw lines that resulted, not because they were trying to put a finger on the scale, but just because they were listening to the testimony of where people were. They drew lines that resulted in an increase in Democrats in both Congress and state legislature, and a huge increase in people of color representation and being elected. I'll just say the last piece is that this constitutional amendment does embed Voting Rights Act language into the state constitution. So no matter what SCOTUS does, or whatever the president does, creating some state constitutional protections means that the people of Virginia have the ability to go to the courts. It's one more layer of protection that is so important. And that's why I would urge Loudoun County Democrats to support this amendment.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being on all the way from California. Brian, I'm going to go to you next. You've been working on nonpartisan redistricting for a very long time, and I know you're very sincere. Your heart is in this, and I've appreciated you joining us tonight. Would you like to give us 2 minutes or 3 minutes of a closing?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Madam Chair, and Shelley, for putting this on. This has been, I think, the most informative and good back and forth, and I think that has a lot to do with you, Madam Chair, moderating this. Look, I've studied redistricting reform all over the country. I've watched what my friend Kathay's done, and she's probably written more state constitutions than anybody. She's like the Johnny Appleseed of state constitutions, redistricting reform amendments. And she's fighting in Oregon, and they're fighting in Nevada, and we're fighting here in Virginia. The interesting thing is all three of those states are blue right now. They're all having Democrats oppose redistricting reform. And that's pretty universal in every place where Democrats are in charge. So, certainly there are more, I would say, Democrats in favor of reform and even getting more, like Delegate Aird, Delegate Simon. But we're just, you're not seeing enough of that. And we're seeing a pattern pretty much all over. This is pretty good reform that we have in front of us. It's not everything I want. It's not everything that they got in California, but it's surely better than what our friends got in Utah or what our friends got in Ohio or Florida. It's significantly better than that. And I think it's really important that we pass it. I think, you asked a really good question of Delegate Simon of how do we know the Dems just don't want to gerrymander? And I wish I could, because I'm a Democrat, I wish I could say that, no, we just don't. But, you heard stories of what happened in 2018 when this Democratic caucus that's basically constituted now was, going at each other in a very nasty, vicious fight, which I think is a great argument for independent redistricting in the long run, but we don't have that on the table. That's just not an option. And if you want to look at like folks in the Democratic House leadership, if they wanted to oppose this amendment, they saw it coming since February before. Credit to the Legislative Black Caucus members who opposed it consistently, but they could have campaigned on something different. They could have even had private conversations with me, or better yet, Kathay Feng or other folks to have a real conversation about how you can do an alternative to this amendment, but they never did. And you saw, Delegate Price's bill come in late January, and you saw Delegate Simon's substitute come in early March. I mean, when were they gonna try to do this? So it's really hard to look at this and say they were good faith trying to do it when other good bills, even first read constitutional amendments, were like Delegate Levine put forward, were killed in the Rules Committee, and then Delegate Price's original HB 1256 was modified in subcommittee, and it's just tough to see, like, this is more than just a bird in the hand. This is like two birds in the hand, and maybe we can get more in the long run. There's a chance to put citizens at the table. There's a historic chance to put minority protections into the state constitution, and there's tons of transparency, open meetings, open data, whereby we'll get to watch all of it. And I think that's an important feature too. So thank you all so much for having me. Thanks for putting this on, and thanks for your help, Delegate.
Thank you
everybody.
very much. Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate it. And Delegate Aird, I'm going to give you the last word. First of all, thank you. Thank you for speaking out. You have been probably, in Northern Virginia, interestingly, your voice has, I think, been one of the most penetrating voices in the papers up here in the Washington Post and other places. And so I appreciate your passion on this issue very much. And so you want to unmute yourself, and then I'm going to give you the last word, ma'am.
Thank you so much for just all of those kind remarks. And, in my closing remarks, I also want to just thank everyone who has made points this evening. I don't think it can be stated enough times that I think everyone who's been part of this conversation is here for redistricting reform and really wants to see change in the redistricting process. This conversation is in keeping with the democratic process, which basically is important to hear multiple ideas, perspectives, and opinions on the matter. And so, you know, as I close out, I'll just ask you to consider this from a different perspective, which in my mind is the moral argument, which is the impact, again, of this amendment to racial and ethnic communities. If you take just a moment to even think about the national landscape right now, I'm here not far from Richmond. And so I'm hearing and seeing on a regular basis the hurt and pain that so many are expressing because of the mere fact that the laws that were intended to protect people like me, and dare I say my 2 young Black boys, are the same laws that are being weaponized against us and dare I say killing us. So when someone tells me that as we're talking about a really critical law, and they say that the Voting Rights Act that hasn't been reauthorized since 2006 is innately part of this amendment, that we can improve the flaws in this constitutional amendment later, or that this is a step in the right direction, I have to be honest and say I take deep offense, and I take it very personally. The representation that is required right now and historically, especially in Virginia, has a record of deliberate attempts to diminish Black voices and Black representation. I just have to say that we don't have time for later. We don't have time for a future step to reverse the action that would be occurring. And we must get this right the first time. Just for the people who are tuning in, I just have to say, if you find yourself and identify as someone who has beliefs and ideas around the movement for equality and racial justice, I really don't know how you can support this amendment, because this amendment screams the opposite and doesn't protect the very representation that is required right now and that will be required for years to come to undo the injustices that are baked into our books right now. And so, in final closing, I will just say this, you know, this past session, we made history in so many ways. We passed monumental policies like the ban on gerrymandering found in House Bill 1255. And it provided protections in for racial and ethnic minorities and other communities of interest. But if this amendment passes, we will make more history. And that history will become the state where every Democratic member of the Virginia General Assembly that supported that ban, and every Republican member that opposed that ban, it will now be null and void. We will become also the first state in the country to vote instead of taking power away, but from legislators, but rather giving it to legislators in a permanent and unchecked way in our Constitution. All because we wanted something. All because we wanted to make a step in the right direction. And so as Loudoun Democrats consider this constitutional amendment, I ask you to oppose this amendment because it's a moral and political necessity. And ultimately, I ask you to vote no.
Okay.
Thank you.
So everyone, all the panelists, you were just amazing. I think this was a fantastic conversation. I really do want to thank Shelley for putting this together. She's been working on it very, very hard. I've been getting everyone's been getting lots of emails and texts from Shelley. Shelley, you did a remarkable job. I want to say to Kathay, Loudoun is the best county in the country. I don't know why you're living in California. And listen, you're really involved out here. Just get yourself up together and move out to Loudoun County, Virginia. It's fantastic.
It's over. I'm moving out. You convinced me.
You should. You should. So thank you, everybody. Shelley, I didn't know if you or Lisa had any final words. It's 8:28, so I've done my job as far as us on time. Again, I want to thank Brian Cannon. I want to thank Delegate Lashrecse Aird. I want to thank Kathay all the way from California, and Delegate Simon has already dropped off. And I want to especially thank Shelley. So Shelley, I will hand it back to you for any final words before we get off.
Thank you. My thanks to all 4 of our speakers, to our moderator, and to every one of our attendees. I hope this has been beneficial to all of you. As a reminder, the recorded session will be available tomorrow on loudoundemocrats.org. Have a great evening and stay safe.